Okay, so some time ago, I made a very popular Reddit post, which was about District 12's serious inbreeding problem. And here I am to elaborate and discuss on that post, and also discuss some of the refutals and why they are almost definitely not true. Okay, and basically, I think there's a 99% chance that District 12 was inbred, maybe just 1% benefit of doubt that the refutals are true. So let's first go over the evidence that District 12 is inbred. Okay, first piece of evidence that this might be so. Let's write it down. First, let's increase the font size so that you can see this. Font size 36 should do. I said 36, you bunk. Okay, so the first is its small population of only 8,000 people by Katniss's time, or by the 75th games, right? Now, how long has it been like this? It's also been isolated for a very long time. So complete isolation for min 75 years, right? These are hard signs, okay? And then we have an extreme prevalence of gray eyes. We also have two genetically separate populations. So its effective population in terms of genetic diversity is probably even less. Seam and merchant boys don't marry seam girls and vice versa. So this tells us they're genetically separate. So in terms of inbreeding, in terms of genetic drift, their effective population is going to be even lower, right? These here are the hard signs. Okay. Now on the next slide, I'm going to make a new slide and I'm going to tell you the softer signs, but still pretty strong. Okay. So the softer signs those include let's see. The first of the softer signs is that Panem has been around in 13 districts form for centuries, right? District 11 and 10, well, closest to 12, and 10 are still quite far. Clear, very little crossbreeding with District 11. Actually, clear almost no crossbreeding. Pre-dark days. Reason being that dark eyes dominate over blue or gray eyes. Even a little crossbreeding would make a large number of brown eyed people. Okay. 8,000 is only the peak population. In the past have been even smaller. This is something you have to note. 8,000 is the peak population. If District 12, for example, has been around for 300 years, 200 years ago, they might have had much, much fewer people. They might have had, let's say, even less than 2,000 people, quite possibly, or like less than 5,000, depending on how fast their population is growing. But unless there's some specific calamity, population tends to grow with time. So District 12 might have actually had even fewer people in the past, right? Now, this instance said Pan Am has been around in 13 district form for centuries. Plutarch says this over and over and over again, and it's clear from context clues that District 11, 13, and 10 have to be pretty far from District 12. Okay? We also see that there has to be none because blue and gray eyes are a recessive trait. Even a little bit of interbreeding with the brown-eyed District 11 people, for example, you'd see many seam boys or even merchant people with brown eyes, right? And then the last of the softer signs is poor Hunger Games performance. You see, the other districts are much larger than District 12, so they're less likely to suffer from inbreeding issues, right? Now, this is a bit of a bias here. The books are only about the 10th, 50th, 74th, and 75th games, the few games when District 12 did well. And I can tell you in the next few slides, in a few minutes, why even those are the exception, not the rule, and they're explained pretty well without refuting this District 12 is inbred theory, right? Now, you've got to remember, District 12 is the weakest at the Hunger Games. Now, Katniss says a few signs and reasons. One is they don't have training, they're not well fed, they're poorer than the other districts, and they don't learn their district trade until an older age. But take the example of the first 9 Hunger Games, okay? Now, it's also clear that some people in District 12 would have like minor manual jobs. They can't only have like someone must be there in construction, repairing buildings, all that. So it's not like every kid in District 12 doesn't know how to use tools, for example. And the first 9 games, there was no careers, quite obviously, because well, look at that. The 1 and 2 tributes ran away. That's not career like. The District 4 tributes to 10th games were smaller kids, even though they're deadly, they were smaller in size and age. So this can't be right. So in the first 9 games, there were no careers. All of the districts were starving and almost none of the districts had a district trade that was relevant to the games, right? And yet, District 9 was the joke district. It always got weak, spindly limbed kids. It always died in the first 5 minutes. And this keeps on going. You would think that even if District 12 is not winning, there have to be some games when they get to the top 8. When Katniss and Peeta get to the top 8, Katniss says, we so rarely have anyone to root for here. And you would think at least one game someone's a bit stronger. It's been like over 20 games. Or at least one game someone got lucky, like Wovi in the 10th games, or like Wally in the 50th games. Even though they were weaker, they got pretty far. And yet that hardly ever happens to District 12. So whatever has to be going on in District 12 has to be pretty severe. Also, especially by age 15 and up, males are much stronger than females, and yet both the boy and the girl of District 12 always seem to die quickly, except when a book is written about it. In other words, District 12's performance is even weaker than District 9. And also, District 9 and 8 also performing badly in the Hunger Games is not as strong of a sign against this as you might think. So, the next slide I'm going to tell you. Okay, let's go over it. These are These are the very strong size. They're a small population, complete isolation, and probably centuries. Yeah, insert. Okay. So I'm going to tell you here, these are the hard signs. Let me just make this heading sized. Huh. Softer signs. Okay. So in our new slide, I'm going to say arguments against this theory right here. I'll list out the arguments and I'll tell you why every single argument against this theory that District 12 has inbreeding issues is indeed very, very underwhelming and very unconvincing and is very unlikely to make this untrue. So, arguments against. In my speech, okay, in my speaking, I'm going to actually tell you exactly why each of these arguments against District 12 being inbred is very weak, okay? So, the first argument against is that 5K is enough to prevent and genetic drift. Okay, here's the biggest problem with that. First of all, just because it's technically enough to prevent inbreeding and genetic drift doesn't mean that it's usually enough to prevent inbreeding and genetic drift. For example, one mosquito bite is enough to kill you by disease. That does not mean you start planning your funeral after getting a single bump on your body from a mosquito. Same here. 5K might be technically enough, but it's not usually enough. It's not typically enough. It's not expected to be enough. Okay? So this in inbreeding and genetic drift, we're seeing signs, as seen in the previous slide, that yeah, they're there. The second argument is that signs of inbreeding are never told. Well, this is a very very weak argument. First of all, Katniss is the narrator, and she misses out. She leaves out a lot. She only says things when they're relevant. Okay, so for example, if PETA was not a wrestler, she would never mention District 12 having a wrestling team at all, right? She never mentioned District 12 having gamblers or boxing matches, okay, which we found out does exist in the 50th games. She never mentioned the Covey, even though the author herself confirmed that the Covey's, like Louise Clark Command, is still alive by the time of Mockingjay, right? There's a lot of things that she left out. She never mentioned after watching Hamish's tape that Hamish also had a spear and then later an axe as his main weapon and not just a knife. So Katniss leaves out a lot, and why would she leave out District 12, most of the population being inbred? Well, because it doesn't occur to her as that being something of importance. Okay, until Joanna throws an axe into the cornucopia, she doesn't even realize that the lack of training in the district trade might be holding them back, right? So if this is never brought up, she would have not mentioned it at all. Okay, so just because Katniss never mentioned a sign of inbreeding doesn't mean that this inbreeding was not taking place or wasn't prevalent. Of course it was. Okay, but then if Katniss never mentioned it, there might be other clues that said inbreeding was taking place. Yeah, of course there are. First of all, extreme prevalence of recessive traits like gray and blue eyes. That's one sign. Hamish mentioning that even with only less than 8,000 people, merchant don't marry Steve and all that nonsense. That's another sign that would make it far more likely for inbreeding to take place. That just took you like 1,000 people or like 500 people out of your gene pool. Okay, 500 more to people with different traits out of your gene pool, which is pretty bad. Okay, and then there is Snow mentioning District 12 having these bulging limb kids that always die in the first 5 minutes. But then in that time, all the districts are starving. A lot of kids had terminal issues like tuberculosis, asthma, all that, as we saw in the 10th games. And then why was District 12 always coming in the very last? Then Katniss mentioning we so rarely have someone in the top 8, even in the top 8. And relatively weak people have made it to the top 8 in the Hunger Games we've seen. Like, logically, that's something that can happen frequently, right? And that District 12 barely makes it to the top 8. And that is quite questionable itself, right? Okay, so this is a very strong sign here that just because signs of inbreeding were not mentioned by Katniss, they were almost certainly there, like almost certainly. Like I'm about 99% sure this is true. Okay? Okay, the third is that Merchant also had recessive traits. Well, here's why this here that the Merchant section also had recessive traits is also a quite weak argument. You see, Panem is a constellation of towns that are connected by a rail system and not allowed to actually communicate much. Okay? So just because the Seam had inbreeding doesn't mean the merchants had no inbreeding as well. They also had inbreeding. But why would they not be as inbred? It's very simple. I do think that before the First Rebellion, the merchants were still crossbreeding with merchants of other districts. I think that is the thing. That's why that in this short amount of time, the merchant section, while they were still a little bit drifted up inbred possibly, might not have been quite as inbred as the Seam. Might not have been. Also, other districts did bad. This here is not an argument for it. For example, when District 12 is compared to the other districts, it's always made clear that in a typical Hunger Games, District 12 does terribly, like even worse than District 9, worse than District 8, you name it, it does worse than them, right? Yes, District 12 actually tends to die even faster than District 9, except in the 10th, 50th, and 74th games when they win, right? In very few games did they actually get even to the top 8. And District 9 also had two victors at least, for the 75th games. And then those two added up. Who told you that District 12 is the only district that's been suffering from inbreeding issues? District 9's District 9's trade is grain, but there's already District 11 for agriculture. It's possible District 9, because of their redundant sounding district trade, which was barely even mentioned at all, also had inbreeding issues. So this here is not an argument. Who the heck said that District 12 is the only inbred district, or that the merchants were also not inbred? That makes no sense. Also, my screen froze. Okay, yeah, there we go. Now, the third argument, I mean, sorry, fifth argument against this is that District 12 still had victors like Katniss, Peeta, Haymitch, and Lucy Gray. But the victors seem to be people that would have some sort of uphand, some sort of advantage against this district-wide inbreeding nonsense, right? We actually personally know all the victors. First of all, Lucy Gray is very clearly from the Covey, a first-generation outsider to District 12, right? And someone who lived in District 12 before the inbreeding got even worse because of the post-Dark Days, what's that called? Post-Dark Days limitations, right? So Lucy Gray was an outsider. Okay. Katniss was a crossbreed between the Seam and Merchant. Some people are saying it would ruin the political message. I don't think that Suzanne Collins even intentionally made this sort of political message. I think that some of these readers actually decided this was a political message. But in reality, why can't Katniss be gifted? And this is not something that will make her gifted. It will just make her less disadvantaged, right? And she's very clearly someone special. I mean, you really think that her superhuman bow and arrow skills are some sort of coincidence, something that makes her not special? Are you freaking kidding me? Just because she's ordinary otherwise? So no. Lucy Gray is an outsider, Katniss is a crossbreed, and Peeta is from the merchant sector, which I do believe the merchant sector crossbred with merchants of other districts before the Dark Days. He might not be as inbred, but still a little bit. Okay? Then we have Hamish. Hamish Abernathy seems to be the only pure seam victor, and we don't know enough about his genetic lineage, but every rule here, every group has some outliers that are stronger than usual. Is there a hint that Hamish might have been one of the strongest 16-year-olds in District 12? Obviously. So let's say most of District 12 is inbred. Hamish was the only pure seam victor, and Hamish was obviously strong. He didn't win by luck or by pure tactics. He did fight and all that stuff, right? He could carry heavy loads without being slowed down that much. Like he could move quickly while carrying heavy loads. That requires a special type of strength, right? Were there clues that, let's see, Hamish was the second fastest, and yet he could still fight with careers, carry well his dead body while running faster than a trotting horse, and so on. So Hamish might have actually been the strongest person, the strongest 16-year-old in all of District 12, or at least in all of the scene. So Hamish's win also is not an argument. The strongest guy they had was a guy whose height does not really stand out even, right? Because if he did have a standout height, if he was like 6 foot taller, that probably would have been mentioned by Katniss, who tends to mention what stands out about people. She only mentions Hamish as strong looking with dangerous eyes, and yet we see a sign that he might be one of the strongest, if not the strongest 16-year-old in all of the scene. So not a single 16-year-old in the scene was over 6 foot, right? Not a single 16-year-old in the scene was stronger than reasonably sturdy built Hamish. So if anything, Hamish's strength actually seems to reinforce this whole thing that District 12 has an inbreeding issue. So thanks for listening to me. The video is done for now.